To be recognized for both scholarship and integrity, how many are there in this mundane world? Scholarship is acquired through diligence. Integrity is attained through virtues. Of course, it is understandable that the latter is hard to accomplish. Fortunately, the 5 continents are boundless and vast. The multitude of nations are far-flung and fathomless. Even though one has left the domain of China to meander in foreign lands, one can still encounter erudite men and women from time to time who conduct themselves according to moral principles, whose deeds are laudable and admired by a whole generation. If we examine the recent world of Sinology, there was an exemplar of such distinction by the name of Professor Pierre Ryckmans, whose nom de plume was Simon Leys. He was born on 28 September 1935 and passed away on 11 August 2014. It has been 10 years since his death. Professor Pierre Ryckmans was learned in Western and Eastern studies. His writings in English and French are applauded in Europe, America, and Asia. A fair amount deals with the arts, literature, and politics of China. In the early 70s, he was the first Western scholar to condemn the Cultural Revolution instigated by the Chinese communists. At that time, a great number of communist sympathizers were to be found in the various social sectors of the West, and they were not hesitant to praise and idolize the Cultural Revolution in China. In 1971, the 6th year of the Communist Cultural Revolution, he published Les Habits Neufs du Président Mao. Its English translation, The Chairman's New Clothes, Mao and the Cultural Revolution, was later published in 1978. Overseas Chinese were delighted and consoled, while the Western communist sympathizers maliciously condemned the book. He was not intimidated. In 1974, he followed up with the publication of Ombre Chinoise. Its English translation, Chinese Shadows, was later published in 1977. The book revealed the violent and tyrannical nature of the Chinese Communist regime. Some years afterwards, the Western communist sympathizers were finally awakened, realizing in full that the Cultural Revolution was a horrific catastrophe that befell China, while these sympathizers themselves have now largely dispersed. Professor Ryckmans was a master of translation. In 1997, he published an English translation of the Analects of Confucius, and it earned the reputation of a modern classic in translation. He enjoyed drawings and illustrations. Once in a while, he would practice the art of Chinese seal engraving. In his leisure time, he would take his boat to the sea, serenely sailing to the far horizon. His aspiration ascended above his average contemporaries. He stood by himself and acted alone, nor did he withdraw when confronted by many impediments. He was a devout Catholic. Even in his final days, he annotated different chapters of the Bible in his painstaking penmanship. Western commentaries on the works of Professor Ryckmans have been so plentiful, there is no need to repeat them. However, among the numerous files in the library of Pierre Ryckmans, there's a Chinese magazine clipping dated 22nd October in the 67th year of the Republic, 1978, from the magazine 时报周刊, written by Wen Chuan-san, a Chinese scholar who resided in the United States. The title of the clipping is An Occidental Scholar Who Loves China, the story of Dr. Pierre Ryckmans, author of Chinese Shadows. This article was written 1 year after the publication of the English translation of Chinese Shadows in 1977. The clipping was carefully kept by Professor Ryckmans, probably out of his strong rapport with Wen's writing. The full article is hereby presented. It reads, An Occidental Scholar Who Loves China, the story of Dr. Pierre Ryckmans, author of Chinese Shadows. Recently, I read in a Taiwan newspaper that Dr. Pierre Ryckmans, the newspaper used the Chinese translation of his nom de plume, Simon Leys, wrote an introduction for the execution of Mayor Ying by Jo-hsi. I also read his interview in Hong Kong with the magazine Observer. Naturally, I am reminded of him, a scholar who loves China. I only met Dr. Pierre Ryckmans twice. It must have occurred around 6 or 7 years ago. The first time I met him was at his home in Hong Kong. A friend of mine asked me to go along for a meal of dumplings, to chat casually about topics relating to Chinese literature, art, and even politics. There were many guests at his home that night. I vaguely recollect that Hsiu-Mei was there too. My first impression of Dr. Ryckmans was a typical intellectual, thin, well-mannered, wearing a pair of golden-framed spectacles. He is a Belgian. His surname, according to his own language, is Ryckmans. The Chinese translation is Li Ke Man. He might have told me the story of his Chinese name, but I can no longer remember. I can only recall my view at the time that his name was very Chinese in flavor. What took me by surprise was his exceedingly perfect pronunciation of the Mandarin dialect. A Chinese like myself, who mixes the sounds of North and South, can feel very ashamed. He is not only fluent in Chinese, his choice of words is more precise than that of many Chinese in Hong Kong. That night, we had very few opportunities to talk alone. Every so often, he spoke about the works of historical and contemporary writers, painters, and their pictorial styles. Listening to him talk incessantly, going through the subjects with such familiarity, forming appraisals that were totally fitting, offering his own individualistic opinions, I naturally became ever more respectful. In the presence of this Western scholar, I was unexpectedly able to observe the glory of Chinese culture. He gave me a lasting impression. Later, I realized that he wrote a book about Su Renshan, a 19th century painter. He has indeed exerted a great amount of effort to study Chinese culture. The second time, I met him by chance in the library of a graduate school in Hong Kong. I went there to look for research materials. He happened to be there, accompanied by the cultural attaché of the Belgian consulate in Hong Kong. He told me he recently left Peking. He had stayed there for half a year, and he was a diplomat at the embassy. He said his intention to go to Peking was to gain a better understanding of China and Chinese society. But his activities in Peking were rather restricted. There were very few opportunities to go out nor meet the locals. Hence, he felt frustrated and bored. In order not to waste any more time, he resigned his job. He further told me some entertaining stories about a tour of inland China that was designed for foreign diplomats. This was organized by the Foreign Affairs Department of the Chinese Communist Party. He said the communist cadres took them to some prearranged routes, and he was sick of looking at the phony scenes. Therefore, when they were given a tour of Xi'an city, he managed to evade the translator who was assigned to follow him everywhere. He then walked around the streets of Xi'an by himself and visited the temples which were forced to close down at that time. This was a very interesting experience for him. But after he returned to the tour group, he realized the translator had been looking for him all over the place, and the other communist cadres had also been frantically searching for him. When he saw the face of the translator, sweating and panicking, he knew immediately he had embroiled him in this incident and felt somewhat remorseful. Sure enough, the translator disappeared in the remaining tour. Besides, we also talked about Hsiu-Mei, an early leader of the Chinese Communists. By this time, the Chinese Communists are calling him a traitor. We have all read the essay Redundant Words that Hsu wrote before he was executed by the National Army. We learned of his regret, aversion, and wariness in participating in communist activities. Dr. Ryckmans thought Hsu was an intellectual who somehow joined a revolution. It was difficult to elude tragedy with his intellectual temperament. I have a good deal of empathy with his thinking. One can recognize his penitence before death and his attachment to life. One cannot help but feel sorry for him. Unfortunately, he took the wrong path from the very beginning. Apart from Hsiu-Mei, we also talked about literature in mainland China. I introduced to him a few novels written by young writers to translate, though they were regarded as poisonous weed by the communists. I remember I mentioned A Youngster from the Organization by Wang Meng, News from Within Our Department by Liu Bingyan, Re-Election by Li Guowen, Red Bean by Zhong Pu, and Visitor by Feng Ji. These novels have all been condemned by the communists. But I believe they are those rare novels that can reflect life in mainland China. At that time, he seemed to suggest that he would be interested to translate them for the benefit of Western readers. But whether he managed to get hold of these novels later on is unknown. Recently, these novels have appeared in installments in The Observer, a Hong Kong magazine. However, the commentator of the series is Mr. 林曼书. I have long hoped that Dr. Ryckmans can allocate some time to do the translations, thinking that they are very worth undertaking. I only realized later on that he was preoccupied with writing a few books of great importance. They were published by Université Paris Diderot Paris 7, and they are all very consequential. His 2 books on Chinese painters were published in French. The few recent books such as The Chairman's New Clothes, Mao and the Cultural Revolution, Chinese Shadows, Broken Images, Essays on Chinese Culture and Politics were successively published in French, English, Japanese, German, and others, making a huge impact on academic circles around the world. The New York Times published a long book review on Chinese Shadows by 2 installments. In our brief conversation, I was moved by his passion for China and his deep understanding of Chinese culture. After reading his books, I am touched ever more by the sincerity of his passion. In his interview with the editorial staff of the Hong Kong magazine Observer, he said the reason he wrote The Chairman's New Clothes was to respond to the erroneous news coverages and discussions in the West about the Cultural Revolution, as well as the obstruction and covering up of truth by the media establishment. Hence, the book emulated the innocent and honest child in The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen, who debunked the so-called new clothes of the emperor. In reality, the emperor was laughably naked and wearing nothing. He said, "When others keep consistently quiet in the face of truth, I choose to shout aloud, to point out the facts that everyone see but dare not or unwilling to broach." His words do make sense. At the moment, many of the scholars in the West who study the Chinese Communist Party are shepherded by them only to lie, while others have no insight nor observation ability. Therefore, I believe a scholar like Dr. Ryckmans, who on one hand maintains his innocence, on the other hand possesses observation and analytical abilities, is rare indeed. He said, when he wrote The Chairman's New Clothes, he only chronicled what he witnessed, while in Chinese Shadows, he expressed more of his views. I believe he is objective and writes truthfully. In his reply to the magazine Observer regarding his view of the predicament and status of Chinese intellectuals in mainland China, he said, "The class of Chinese intellectuals no longer exists in mainland China. It disappeared under the many attacks launched by Mao and the Chinese communists. He believes the so-called scientists, writers, etc. are in fact some minuscule employees in the communist and government agencies. They cannot be counted in the category of intellectuals. In his mind, intellectuals are those who bear the sacred responsibility to criticize society. Today, in mainland China, the so-called intellectuals, apart from shouting slogans and trotting behind the backs of the powerful, or eulogizing the achievements and goodness of the party, really have no accomplishment whatsoever. In fact, they play the roles of jesters. They are not to be compared with the traditional Chinese scholars who assume the problems of the world as their own responsibilities, nor those high-minded and upright intellectuals. Such profundity in his way of thinking is particularly absent from the Western scholars who see things through their prejudiced lenses. Another contribution by Dr. Ryckmans is introducing Chinese culture to Western readers. He translated and published 6 chapters of A Floating Life by Shen Fu and works by other Chinese writers. He studied, commented, and introduced the painters Su Renshan, Si Tao, and Huang Binghong. Recently, I heard he is translating a novel by Chen Jo-hsi into French. His meticulous and resolute approach to the research and advancement of the studies of China and Chinese culture is to be highly valued. His advantage is his combination of the tradition of European Sinology and the merits of modern Chinese studies. No wonder he achieved such depth in his studies of China. The above article was written by Wen Chuan-san, original name Huang Tsai-sheng. He was born in 1945 and passed away in 1991. His other nom de plume were Haifeng, Wang Hancao, Huang Zifan, Huang Zun. He was a native of Haifeng, Guangdong Province. In 1966, he graduated from a university in Guangdong, and in the same year, the Chinese Communists launched the Cultural Revolution. He fled to the countryside, and in 1968, opportunity arose for him to flee to Hong Kong. He worked as a researcher at the Union Research Institute in Hong Kong. In 1975, he left Hong Kong to study in the United States, joining the University of Missouri, where he attained his doctorate degree. Later, he was a researcher at Miami University in Ohio and a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan. He was a poet, essayist, novelist, sociologist, historian of modern Chinese literature, and an expert on the Chinese Communist Party. His works include an outline of the Cultural Revolution in Haifeng, an outline of the course of the Cultural Revolution in Canton District, eclectic thoughts of a marginalized person, that half of the Chinese literary world, squid-consuming sociology, bearers of an era's woes, American Life, Chinese Sentiments. Another article he wrote about Professor Ryckmans was Awakening the Academic World of Chinese Studies with Ryckmans' Innocence, published on 13th March 1983 in China Times newspaper. Professor Pierre Ryckmans lived in Belgium and Australia for many years. The laws of both countries clearly enshrined freedom of speech and publication. Hence, he was granted the right to assume the problems of the world as their own responsibilities and managed to implement his life mission as an intellectual. If he had stayed in mainland China, how could he implement any of his lofty principles? Ambassador Hsiu-Mei, 1891 to 1962, at one time said that overseas Chinese should embrace those Chinese trapped in the Iron Curtain with compassion and empathy. They should not be harsh on their speech and action. This is indeed an advice full of wisdom. As for those in Europe, America, and elsewhere living outside mainland China, although they are comfortably endowed with freedom of speech and publication, yet many of them are willing to flatter and support tyranny, indifferent to the suffering of the people. Professor Ryckmans witnessed this and wielded his conscientious pen to become the voice of the people. We can perceive his unquenchable indignation. Reading this article by Wen Chuan-san, 46 years later, one is still affected by an avalanche of thoughts and emotions.